Okay, good evening, everyone. My name's Hannah Weisfeld. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of Yachad. I'm really pleased that we're welcoming Jeremy Ben-Ami, who's the president of J Street, here this evening. Just to give you a little bit of background and context and a small piece of housekeeping. So we'll start with housekeeping, which is that we are on a Zoom webinar, which means that nobody can hear anything you're saying. And so don't worry about background noise or anything like that. Jeremy and I are gonna talk for about half an hour, and then we're gonna open it up to discussion. Somewhere in the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box. If you have a question, type it into the Q&A box, and when we get to the questions, I'm gonna invite people to ask their question, at which point you will be unmuted and you'll be able to ask Jeremy directly, and we'll be able to see you and hear you. We probably won't get to all of them, but we will try to get through as many as possible. The piece of context I want to give you, which is really important, is that for those of you who've not seen, because this will definitely come up in conversation, this morning the news came from Israel that the new coalition agreement, which was signed between Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, is lawful. There were a number of cases against it in the Supreme Court, a number of petitions. They've been struck out. The Knesset has voted in support of the coalition deal, and the new government will formally come to power. I think it's the 13th of May, but it's definitely next week. The thing that is concerning a lot of Jewish organizations around the world is that part of that coalition agreement is a clause which allows Benjamin Netanyahu to bring to the cabinet or the Knesset as a whole legislation to advance annexation of the West Bank. There's not a specific piece of territory demarcated in it. There's not a specific amount or a time or a date. But from July the 1st onwards, he has the authority to be able to do it. And obviously, that's kind of front and center of a lot of discussions that we are having as an organization. I know that's certainly the same for J Street. And what happens in America and what happens with the presidential election will have a significant impact on that, most likely. To introduce you to Jeremy. Jeremy, as I said, is the president of J Street. For those of you who don't speak transatlantic English, I guess our equivalent is chief exec or director, but Jeremy has been the president of J Street from its inception. He has a long-standing family connection to Israel, which goes back 130 years, and his great-grandparents were on the first Aliyah, and they settled in Petah Tikva, and his grandparents were founding families of Tel Aviv, and his father was an activist and leader in the Irgun. Jeremy has got a wide array of political experience in Washington, and I'm not going to list it all, but just a couple of things which I think are worth flagging, which is that he was the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor to President Bill Clinton, and he served as Howard Dean's National Policy Director. He has a host of accolades, including being the Jerusalem Post's, one of the Jerusalem Post's 50 most influential Jews in the world. So Jeremy, we're very honored to have such an influential Jew joining us all the way from DC today. The purpose of this discussion is really for you to give us a sense of what's going on in America, what's likely potentially to happen in the American elections, and how that might change current policy in the White House. I think, I guess just to preface that with, I think there is a sense in Anglo Jewry that we're minor players in this discussion, and that when we look at what's going on in America and when we look at what's going on in the Middle East, we kind of look to the American Jewish community and I guess the influence they have and the way in which they vote and what impact that has, you know, politically. And really, I guess we're interested here in your sense of what's happened in America in the last few years with Trump and what might happen should Trump be replaced in January if Biden wins the presidency in November. And so maybe we can start with you giving us, could you give us a kind of overview of what's already happened since Trump has come to power? How much of a sea change is he and his policy? And is that specifically Trump, or is that a kind of Democrat-Republican thing?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Hannah, and it's wonderful to be with you. And I think this is the first time that we've actually done a joint program, and it's amazing how this coronavirus situation is actually bringing about some good things, you know, and I'm really glad that we're doing this together, and I hope that we'll do more together. We share a lot in terms of the values that we are promoting and also the policies. And so this is hopefully the beginning of many more connections and interchanges. So I would say that the last 3+ years under Donald Trump have been the fantasy of the settler right wing in both Israel and the United States, that the policies that have traditionally been at the center of Republican Party American foreign policy and or Democratic traditional American foreign policy are just out the window with this administration. Whether it was George H.W. Bush 30 years ago, or it was his son even who pursued Annapolis, or it's Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, or you go back before, it has been a bipartisan traditional approach to Israel and to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and to the Middle East to pursue an end to the conflict that actually is based in the UN Security Council resolutions that we call a two-state solution now, but that has never been a partisan divide, never been a partisan wedge. It is only under Donald Trump, it is only in these last 3.5 years that the Republican Party in this country has veered so radically to the right and has become 100% associated with the farthest right wing in Israeli politics. And I, give a lot of credit in the negative way to Ambassador David Friedman, who I often refer to not as the US ambassador to Israel, but as the settler ambassador to the United States. David Friedman's influence on what has happened over the last 3+ years in the United States can't be overstated. It's kind of shocking. It's very rare that an ambassador is actually a policy driver. But the same is true, I would say, in Israel, that the most ideological folks on these issues drive and control the debate. And they have had an outsized influence on Israeli policy, and now they're having an outsized influence on American policy. And so the, recognition of Jerusalem, the movement of the embassy, the cutting off of aid, the scrapping of the use of the word occupation, the abandonment of the concept that there's an occupation, now the vision, supposed peace plan that was put forward in February. All of these are direct outgrowths of the strategy and the vision and the politics of David Friedman and the right-wing settler groups that have such outsized influence now in American politics. So this is a dramatic change and a huge break from what has been bipartisan American foreign policy for decades.
And so I guess following on from that, the fact that annexation is now front and center of this new coalition agreement, we've seen some kind of remarks from Pompeo in the past couple of weeks, basically saying, Israelis do what you like. But can we expect any kind of intervention from the White House at all with anything that the Israelis might decide in July?
Well, there is, as with so many things that happen in this Trump administration, there is debate and there are different points of view. The Jared Kushner point of view and some of the other people who worked on that document is actually a belief that what they've put forward is in fact a blueprint that could lead towards a resolution of the conflict. And their view is that, in fact, this document needs to be taken as a whole, and that if Israel is to take advantage of the benefits that are being given, in terms of control over such a large portion of the West Bank, then Israel also has to give on the question of Palestinian statehood and the beginning of meaningful negotiations. And they do not, there's a faction within the Trump administration that does not want to see annexation move alone on its own track and wants Israel to have to accept the entirety of the plan. That was a signal that was given right after the February presentation of the vision, when Gantz and Netanyahu came to the White House and the vision was rolled out, and Netanyahu ran back to Israel and said, we're going to bring this, right to the Knesset. And the right wing in Israel said, whoa, not so fast. We don't want to give our approval or our okay to a plan that actually uses the word Palestinian statehood. And Netanyahu was forced to pull back. I don't know if you remember that sequence of events, but it was supposed to be a Sunday vote, and he pulled it. And there is still a faction in the Trump world, and Kushner apparently is a part of it, that is saying, we should not give a green light simply to annexation. What we need to give a green light to is Israel's acceptance of the whole plan. Over and over again, that faction has lost in every debate in the White House over 3+ years. And the Friedman, Pompeo, Nikki Haley, Pence, it's tied into the evangelical community. It's not just a right-wing Jewish political force that's promoting it. Those forces have carried the day in every argument. So whether there will be pushback between now and July 1, and whether or not Netanyahu and the settlers will be told, no, you can only move forward if you're moving forward with the whole package, is probably going to be a subject of some intense conversations in the coming 6 or 7 weeks.
Okay, so it's not it's not necessarily clear cut.
Right. It's not much better though than a 10 or 20% chance. I mean, nothing is ever simple and clear cut, but this one, you can pretty much count on the Friedman wing winning the debate in the White House.
And if so, I guess the follow-on question is that, do you think there is a chance that Netanyahu might fear a Biden win and not want to kind of do something preemptively that might damage his relationships with the next administration? Is that a big enough kind of stick to kind of put brakes on it?
Well, certainly that's the only point of leverage that we can see here in America. That in terms of what can we do in these 6 or 7 weeks now, 2 months, to try to stop annexation. The single most important message that we want to convey over and over and over again, not just to Bibi, but also to Gantz, to Ashkenazi, to others within the coalition, to other folks in the security and defense establishments, intelligence, to convey over and over and over again that doing this does put at risk one of the prime national security assets of the state of Israel. The bipartisan support in the United States for Israel, and what it has resulted in terms of not simply dollars, but the level of diplomatic and security protection and cooperation internationally, all of that could be put at risk by taking a step that breaks bipartisan consensus around Israel in this country. And so it's not just the risk of Biden winning, it's the risk to the basis of American support, the bipartisan basis, but also within the Jewish community, that losing the liberal part of the American Jewish community and losing the younger generations is also a threat to that consensus that has held for decades now and been a real serious national security asset. So that, I think, is the one point of leverage that J Street sees, that American liberal Jews see, and trying to convey that message as often as we can through as many different ways as we can.
And I mean, Biden has come out and said that he does not support annexation, which presumably is very helpful for you in conveying that message.
Absolutely. Biden has conveyed that, and he just had an interview, I think, 2 days ago. It was a briefing paper submitted to our Jewish news service called the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, or JTA, and he had a series of things actually in there that he said, that under a Biden administration, we will restart aid to the Palestinians. We will reopen the independent consulate to the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. We will reopen the PLO mission. It will be a new day, and it will be a reversal of many of the steps that the Trump administration has taken over the course of these last 4 years. Just as easily as they were given, they can be taken away. And so those kinds of steps are within the purview of the executive branch to do something about. The annexation. What the United States can do policy-wise is take away its official government recognition of the annexation. The United States can't reverse the annexation. Israel will pass laws, or it'll take decisions at the cabinet level that under Israeli law will shift things there. And it won't be within the power of Biden or the American government to reverse what the government of Israel has done. but what can be reversed is American recognition. And I think that is also, a clear message that should be heard in Israel, that you will not have American recognition for this step that you take in July of 2020. You will not have it in January of 2021 any longer. And, the way that politics are moving in the United States, I know you wanted to discuss how does it look for the elections, and it's, to my mind, the single most important question for the fate of the world, is whether or not we can reverse this.
We need some hope. So I hope you've got a good answer for us.
Yeah. But the one caveat on this discussion is that I spent the better part of 2016 reassuring everybody, including my wife, that there was absolutely no chance that Donald Trump could ever be elected president of the United States. So, whatever.
Well, I have to tell you, Jeremy, I suspect there's a lot of people on this webinar who spent a lot of 2016 saying that Britain would never leave the European Union and
right.
the European Union. So, we've all become very skeptical about any poll.
Right. Well, we should also be skeptical of ever using the word never. That I think is, the preponderance of the evidence, and we're leaning towards, but the word never is always a dangerous one. So, so here I am, I'm back in 2020 to say that, the nitty gritty micro analysis of American politics is that somehow Donald Trump threaded a needle in 2016, and his victory amounted to 100,000 votes spread across 3 key states, and a swing of 10 or 20,000 votes in any of those states would have swung the election. So when you now look at 2020 and you ask the question, are some of the people who didn't turn out in 2016 now motivated to turn out, right? Is there a candidate for the Democratic Party who doesn't have some of the negatives that our candidate had in 2016, and therefore you won't have people sort of not voting? In Michigan, the Senate candidate for the Democrats got 60,000 votes more than Hillary Clinton got on the presidential line. People just left that blank. They couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary Clinton. They were in the ballot box. Democrats, they voted down the line Democrat, and they left President blank, and she lost by less than 60,000 votes. So the reason she lost was because of Democrats who were actually at the polls. It's not even people who had to be turned out. It's not a get out the vote. It's get out your pen and actually, fill in that box on the ballot has to be our campaign. So I do believe that this is an eminently winnable election for the Democrats, that Donald Trump has lost a percentage of the people who voted for him, and there are more people now ready to vote for Biden than voted for Clinton. So I do believe there's a good chance of him winning. And then if he does win in terms of our policies, I think that you will see in January, pretty much right after coming into office, a series of steps taken in those first days and weeks that will reverse some of the things that have been done. And the idea that, the United States would recognize this illegal annexation, I'm convinced that will be reversed as well.
And just one final follow-up question to that, and then we'll open it up to questions. If say, for the sake of argument, they annex some territory between July and January, and Biden becomes the president, and the US then kind of undoes that recognition of the annexation, what does that technically mean in terms of how it treats Israel, how it deals with its kind of trading relations? Is there any implication beyond just a statement of derecognition?
Yeah, no, look, the parallel I often remind people is that Israel annexed 70 square kilometers around Jerusalem, right? In 1968, it annexed 26 Arab villages and a big swath of territory right around Jerusalem. It is an illegal annexation that is over the green line in occupied territory, and Israel has annexed and applied its law to that territory. If there's ever to be a conflict ending agreement, Israel will have to undo some of that annexation. There are towns, and some of your people have probably traveled and seen East Jerusalem, and there are Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem that would become part of a state of Palestine and be the capital of the state of Palestine. For that to happen, Israeli annexation has to be undone by an act of Knesset with 80 votes. The exact same procedure would have to happen for anything else. If the Jordan Valley, if some of the territory in Area C that isn't really in the heart of a settlement block, any of that territory, it's the exact same thing would have to happen. So America's recognition of that, being the only country out of 194 countries that actually says this is in fact Israeli sovereign territory, that has no legal impact whatsoever. And our joining the other 193 countries and saying no, it won't change it on the ground either, and it won't have an impact on American policy. The separate question is, will the United States use any of the tools in its toolkit to exert pressure on Israel to roll back unilaterally some of the steps? That's a separate question. And, you know, I don't see that happening. You know, I think a lot of people will call for cutting aid, restricting aid, conditioning aid. We may well, as J Street, call for restricting aid to Israel so that it can't be used in annexed territory, for instance. But I don't think that that's going to be sufficient to cause the Knesset to meet and have 80 votes and the Knesset say, okay, you're right, we take it back. I don't see that happening. So I think, you know, the United States can threaten a lot and can talk a lot, but I don't know that it can have the unilateral pressure to cause Israel to reverse a step that it takes this year.
Fine, and then I'm going to ask you, so I said it was my last question, but I'm going to ask you one final thing, which is that, I mean, we have some sense maybe of where Biden sits on this issue because, you know, of roles he's held previously, but do you think he would be able, I mean, I guess this is you can't answer this, but do you think he would be able to do what no president has done before, which is actually get the Israelis and the Palestinians to a place where two states is back on the agenda in a serious way? Because what we've seen over the last 8 years is effectively a rollback to kind of what is almost pre-1993 with Oslo. And that, you know, it certainly feels to me that they are further away from a kind of two-state discussion than they have ever been since the Oslo peace process. And
yeah, I think that the lesson that everybody has drawn, you know, whether it's been presidents, secretaries of state, other forms of diplomats, you know, until Prime Minister Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister, and until you actually have an Israeli leader who has a interest in and a desire in actually diplomatically resolving the conflict, it's not going to happen. And so it doesn't matter who the president of the United States is. It doesn't matter how, you know, deep their desire is to do it. You know, John Kerry was the Secretary of State who was more obsessed with this idea than anyone has ever been. You know, and even if he had been president of the United States, you know, with Bibi there and with the settlers in control, I don't think it's going to happen. You have to have a different Israeli leadership. And, you know, frankly, I think on the Palestinian side, it's, you know, you need a different face and a different leadership as well. So it's just not enough to have an American president who wants it to happen. You've got to have the Israeli and the Palestinian alignment towards that goal as well. And then the United States can play a really helpful role, but it can't do it without a desire for the parties to actually get it done.
Fine, okay, so we're going to open it up to Q&A. If it's all right with you, what I think we might do is take 3 at a time, and then hopefully that will kind of get us over any technical glitches we might have as well. So actually, I'm just going to let people know, just so you're ready to be called upon. So the first one is actually from an anonymous person, so I'm going to read it out. We're then going to ask Philip Goldenberg to ask his question, and then Simon Sadie, who is actually our chair, so you'll see him on the screen. So the anonymous one is, how have US pro-Israel Jewish and non-Jewish organizations more widely responded to annexation? Is there a wide divide or majority leaning one way or another? And is it as controversial as you would like it to be, or as you would hope, the question is? So that's the first question. Philip, we're going to unmute you to ask your question. Okay, I think you're coming on.
Screens with my name on it.
Hello, can you hear? We can hear you.
Yep. Okay, you can hear me.
Yes.
I'm supposed to press something to start my video.
Well, we'll see you if you press that.
Oh, that's
There you are.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Can I ask you as a Democrat, really, in terms of the US Constitution, somebody can only be elected twice as president. And I quote those words exactly. So what is to stop Obama running as vice president and in a position constitutionally to succeed Biden in either of his terms for the rest of that term, should it be necessary?
And we're going to go to, thank you, Philip. We're going to go to Simon next for his question.
Simon, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. So what I wanted to ask was, is the question of Israel really about the mathematics of the electoral college and winning an election, and as a result, really to do with the candidate's attitude to the the nationalist right wing in the US and the evangelical Christian vote, and actually little to do with the Jewish community, i.e. It's really nothing to do with us at all, and actually what we think on this doesn't really matter.
Good questions. So let me start with the first, the question being whether the mainstream established long-standing organizations have taken a position on this. There have been over the course of the last year some statements. For instance, the Anti-Defamation League has had a strong statement about the damage that annexation could do. The Reform movement has had good statements at times here. Rick Jacobs, who's the head of the Union of Reform Judaism. What you have not seen is a sustained campaign from the heart of the Jewish establishment. If you think about things like, let's say, the Iran nuclear deal, when the Jewish community desires to speak loudly and clearly and with a repetitive voice that echoes itself over and over, it can, and it knows how to do that. And on the Iran deal, they just kept saying no, 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 and you knew it. And every federation and every AIPAC office and every branch of every organization repeated the same talking points. So that is not happening here at all. There is a great deal of quiet concern in the mainstream, and behind closed doors, a number of mainstream leaders are in deep fear about what this will mean for the US-Israel relationship and the growing partisan divide. They're conveying that message to Netanyahu, they're conveying it to other Israelis, but there has not been a public statement. And so that is a major goal of ours, is to try to get some more of these folks who are quietly behind the scenes saying these things to actually come out and say them publicly, because I think that would really help the debate. On the question of Obama as vice president, as much as I might love that idea myself, we all every day mourn the departure of Barack Obama from the White House. And apparently, according to constitutional scholars, is not possible. There are plenty of people who have asked that exact question, and the plain reading of the text of the Constitution doesn't seem to rule that out. But constitutional scholars, based on other drafting documents and on other court cases, do believe that it is not possible for a former president to be nominated to serve as vice president. And then the third question was about the relative importance and influence, let's say, on the direction of the Israel debate in the United States of the Jewish community versus the evangelical Christian community. And just like I think one never should say never, and one can't be absolute in any form of analysis, it's similar here that it is not the case that, there's no longer influence from the Jewish community and that the evangelical community is now the factor, right? It is a factor and it is an important factor. And particularly, I would say, in the Republican Party and in our primary politics within the Republican Party, as let's say a Mike Pence or a Nikki Haley consider running for president in 2024, and people like Mike Pompeo and others in even looking at the Senate or House races, the main race that a Republican has to win in order to get into office is a Republican primary. And within the Republican primary, the evangelical vote is unbelievably important. And this issue has become one of the 3 or 4 central values issues. Guns, the issue of choice, there are a few other issues. And Israel is kind of like that level of a values issue now in the evangelical community, and perceived to be something that you just have to run as hard to the right as you can in a Republican primary context. But I'd say that the issue for Biden and the issue for a general election in the United States, when Democrats are running against Republicans, and the question is the swing vote in Florida or the swing vote in Pennsylvania, it's not whether or not evangelicals will break from Democrats and suddenly vote for Trump or the vice versa based on Israel, because they're not going to vote for the Democrats. The questions that Democratic political strategists are asking and trying to nuance where Democrats run on Israel is out of fear of losing people on the right in the Jewish community, and not only losing their vote, but in many cases also losing potential financial supporters. And so that element of the politics is still really important in the Democratic Party and also in a general election context.
Jeremy, can I just jump in and just to kind of also respond to one of these questions about to what extent is there opposition within the community, and is it as significant as you would like? Just to kind of draw a UK comparison, I would say that what you painted as the American picture is very similar here, which is that very mainstream, middle of the road, donors, philanthropists, organisations are really kind of concerned, and the question is to what extent they're going to start articulating that publicly, which up until now has been something that people have generally shied away from doing. But I think that is something we're going to see emulated in Jewish communities around the world now. We're going to go to Martin Linton, and then we are going to follow immediately Neil Weisfeld, who I have to declare a family interest there. He's my father. And then our third question is from, sorry, I'm just scrolling here, is from Maggie Foyer. So if you could just all get yourselves ready. So Martin, I can see you're already up there to ask your question.
Hi, Hannah. Thank you, Hannah. And it's an honor to get in before your father.
I have to hope he does embarrass me, even as a grown adult.
My question is about Joe Biden and the US Embassy in Jerusalem. He said he's not going to take it back to Tel Aviv. In your view, is that because he has come to believe that it's a good idea to have it in Jerusalem, and that he recognizes Jerusalem as the capital, the capital of Israel, or is it because he kind of recognizes that he would lose votes and that he would make it would be a vote losing issue? And if the latter, would he be able to change it once elected? Is it something that a battle that he could fight once he was elected?
Thank you, Martin. So Neil, if you're there. I think we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello, Jeremy. I won't embarrass Hannah, but we have met once very briefly. Anyway, based on everything that one's reading and has been said tonight, it would appear that Benny Gantz has completely sold out, let's say the centrist or maybe not so extreme right-wing position of his party, which managed to achieve quite a reasonable result in Parliament, although not a majority or even close to a majority. If that is the case, if Biden were to be elected, does that effectively mean that a change in policy by the US government isn't going to go anywhere in Israel, largely because Biden doesn't have any partner to work with? In other words, if Gantz was, let's say, a free agent and a potential electable prime minister or a negotiable prime minister in his own right, then one would think that Biden would have a place to go to work out a deal, a new deal. But if Gantz has sort of chained himself to Netanyahu, then one can't see how that can go anywhere.
Thank you. And then Maggie is our final question for this round. Can we hear you, Maggie?
Yeah, good. Okay.
Can hear you.
I just wanted to know if there was any system of checks and balances in the Knesset or any of the Israeli legal systems to stop this annexation, which just seems like outright theft. I don't know enough about the workings of it. And just to say thank you, Jeremy, for so much insight into the American point of view.
Thank you. Right, so you got those three, Jeremy. Sorry, we're bombarding you here.
No problem at all. So the embassy question, Biden has made it abundantly clear, and I know his people very well, and I've discussed this a lot over the course of the last couple of years with them. He will not be moving the embassy back. I think there's two levels of reason for that. I think everything is about picking your battles, and many Democrats have voted over the course of the years for legislation that reiterated over and over again that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and the embassy should be in Jerusalem. And I think probably even Biden voted for that. Certainly Obama voted for that. Hillary Clinton voted for that. I mean, everybody has had to take that stand at some point. And so to roll it back would be such an enormous political lift. And the question is, whether or not there's actually any real value to that, because at the end of the day, J Street itself, and I don't know where Yahad stands on this, but Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. We recognize that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. The question is, how do you also make parts of Jerusalem the capital of Palestine, right? That's the challenge. And I think where the Biden people will head is in some way through reopening the consulate in the eastern part of the city and having the political mission, the diplomatic mission, split out again. It's been put underneath the embassy to Israel. I know that for you all, you have a separate embassy and a separate diplomatic mission to the Palestinians, right? And you have a consul general who relates to the Palestinians, who has an office in the eastern part of the city. Well, most countries have that. We used to have that. And I think Biden will reestablish that. And I think there will probably be an indication in the move when he makes it, if he's elected president. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but if we have that opportunity, I would imagine that the way they would do it was also with an indication that one day that consulate will be an embassy. And it will be an embassy to a state of Palestine that will have its capital in East Jerusalem. And I think they will try to balance out the negatives from what was done by Trump regarding this facility in the western side of the city by saying there will be one in the eastern side. But I don't see the value. It's not a battle worth picking and a battle worth fighting, in my opinion, or really in their opinion. In terms of Gantz and your dad's question, look, I don't think there's a single voter who supported blue and white who doesn't feel that their vote was stolen now, right? I think there is a sense of treason, there's a sense of theft and deception. People did not vote for Benny Gantz by and large because they were so enamored of Benny Gantz and wanted him to be prime minister. There was 90% of the energy behind blue and white was to defeat Netanyahu and ensure that he wouldn't be the next prime minister. And then suddenly their votes, swing over and make Netanyahu the prime minister. So yes, there was a huge sense that he sold out. Now you ask the question, well, let's say, and most of us don't believe this will ever happen, but let's say that this agreement is actually followed. And Benny Gantz does in fact become prime minister of the state of Israel in November of 2021. Right. I think it's a pretty unlikely prospect, but it is in fact what the agreement says, and that's what Gantz is expecting right now until he is sold out and hung out to dry by Netanyahu. So let's say that Gantz is prime minister and it's 2021 and it's 2022 and Joe Biden is now the president. And Biden goes to Gantz and says, I think that it would be good for all of us and good for the region. And, the Arab world is really suffering in the wake of this economic depression, and you can be the economic engine, the way that Shimon Peres used to talk to me about it, back in the old days, and couldn't we figure something out? He might have an interested ear in Gantz. The question is whether or not then Gantz would have the credibility and the ability to lead Israel to that direction. Ultimately, if any of us, Hannah and we, if our visions and Yahan and J Street is ever to come to pass in the 2020s, 30s, 40s, 50s, it's going to require real political leadership in Israel. And you're going to need a leader who's going to stand up in front of the people and explain why this is the best thing to happen, and why it's in the self-interest of the state and of the Jewish people, and the military and the security people would stand behind that leader. And it would have to come from the center right. It's not going to be Ayman Odeh, and it's not going to be Nitzan Horowitz, and it's not going to be Mirav Michaeli or Stav Shafir who does this. It's going to be a Benny Gantz-like figure, somebody from the center right, who is doing it out of self-national interest and with a heavy heart at giving up the birthplace of the Jewish people and our faith and our religion, but we're going to do that out of the sake of having a state that can survive and have a Jewish majority and be accepted around the world. Benny Gantz could be that figure. I don't rule it out. And he will, if this agreement is actually implemented, he will be prime minister one day. So who knows? I don't want to rule it out, but I think his credibility is shot. I don't think he can mobilize the country in that way, but maybe these 18 months will change that, because I never say never. And then the third question was about the checks and the balances in Israel itself. The Supreme Court just allowed, indicted felon to become the prime minister of Israel. It has green-lighted all of the activities that go on under the occupation. The annexation of Jerusalem has been ruled legal. There is no check and balance on this in the Israeli system. The only potential for legal accountability would be through the International Criminal Court. And of course, that is very, very controversial and is underway right now. And the prosecutor just filed a brief last week, and this is taking forever to grind through the international legal system. But if there's ever to be a court and a legal sense of accountability for something being right or wrong, the only chance that it might happen would be through the international courts. It's not going to be through the Israeli system, which has basically just said this is all okay and doesn't want to stand in the way.
Just to add to that, Jeremy, that even if the ICC were to rule that it's not legal, that doesn't necessarily change the facts on the ground. Anyway, I mean, we've seen that in other cases, like Sudan, for example. We're going to go to, there's a couple more questions. So we're going to go to Liz Silman, and then my colleague Maya is going to ask a question. I think we can hear you, Liz.
Okay, sorry. Could you please explain how things will change for the Palestinians who already live under de facto sovereignty in the occupied territories if Israel decides to impose legal sovereignty?
Thank you. And Maya, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello. Hi. Thanks for this very interesting discussion so far. My question is about what are the opinions or the feeling in American Jewish communities about potential coalitions or collaborations between liberal Zionists or Zionist parties with non-Zionist parties. There was a lot of talk after the last election about the potential coalition or support from without, from outside the government of the Arab Joint List. I just wonder how is that received in American Jewish community?
Great, both really, really good questions. I hope I will do them justice. So the first question, what is the actual impact on the day-to-day lives of Palestinians? That is a really important question, and it's not actually asked enough, and people don't understand the exact answer clearly enough, because people immediately leap to apartheid. You know, they say, well, as soon as this annexation happens, then it's apartheid, and it's the end of Israel's democracy. And so what I think is important to understand is that the annexation that's going to take place, if it takes place, is going to be done with a fine-tooth comb, right? It's going to be done with a scalpel, and there will be an effort to draw a map of territory that will be annexed that will maximize the ability for the settlements to expand and minimize the number of Palestinians that actually live within the territory that will be annexed. There may well be 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, I don't know, Palestinians who actually would live in territory over which Israeli sovereignty would be extended. 50,000 is not a very large number. Now, for some right-wingers, there's a principle that you wouldn't want one Palestinian to be offered citizenship. But there's the Ruby Rivlin right wing, right? There's the view that if you're going to take the land, you got to take the people, and they have to be equal citizens. And so it is not clear to me what would happen with that small number of Palestinians who would actually be brought into the state of Israel under their laws that would apply to the place where they live. And further unclear is whether the Palestinians that live there would actually take the citizenship. Because remember, 300,000 Palestinians live in East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is annexed territory and is part of the state of Israel. And theoretically, the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem had the right and have the right. It was easier years ago. It's not so easy now, but you can still apply for Israeli citizenship, but they choose not to, as a political statement of not wanting to recognize the legitimacy of the annexation. So the question of whether or not the 50,000 Palestinians or whatever number, and again, no one knows the number because we don't know the map and there's no accurate counts, but it's going to be a small number. Would those people be offered citizenship, and would they accept the citizenship? Those are big unknowns, but in terms of the day-to-day life for 2.6 million Palestinians on the West Bank under occupation, nothing will change. The exact same rules of the road will apply to 95+% of Palestinians who live over the Green Line. They will continue to live in areas A and B. They will continue to have their municipal services and their civil services provided by the Palestinian Authority, with some degree in B a little bit more and A a little bit less of Israeli security presence. And so, in terms of the law, the change in daily life is not going to be as great as I think some of the nightmare scenarios make it appear on day one. A lot of the nightmare scenarios depend on what happens over time as dominoes begin to fall, and if security cooperation fails, and if the PA fails, and unrest and another intifada, and there's a lot of things that could happen over time. But on July 1st, if they annex on July 1st, on July 2nd, the impact is not that significant. That's my view, and I think it's really important to just have that information and discuss it a little bit. Maya, in terms of the question about how are American Jews viewing the participation and the potential partnership between liberal Jewish Zionists in Israel and liberal, or even not so liberal, non-Zionist parties, there is actually more openness to that in the mainstream of American Jewry than there is about the rights of Palestinians on the West Bank. It's a very interesting thing, but the American Jewish community, and I don't know if this is true in the UK, and I'd be interested to hear, Hannah, is there actually, as much interest there in the well-being of the Arab citizens of Israel as there is here. We have a whole task force of our federations that invest lots of money, and there's lots of engagement, and it's sort of like become a thing to invest in and believe in that society and to see them be full members of Israel. And so the concept that they would actually be part of the politics has a broader degree of support than, let's say, opposing annexation or some of the things that we might stand for vis-a-vis the occupation. So I do think that that's an exciting development, that this community here is a little bit more willing to accept and understand.
So just to answer that question briefly, and then we've got one more question we're going to go to. That's the same here. It's much easier, I think, and much less politically contentious to talk about the integration of Palestinian citizens of Israel than it is to talk about what happens to Palestinians living over the Green Line. And we had until very recently, and it's kind of morphed into something different now, a similar task force here, which was built off the American model. And it included mainstream organizations that do not generally engage on political issues to do with occupation, to do with Palestinians, kind of recognizing, I guess, that it is reasonable, if you want to call it Israel's democracy, to talk about how you integrate an Arab minority. I mean, what you're not seeing, and this is a kind of the flip of that, is that, you know, you're not seeing much public opposition, having said that, in our, you know, from mainstream organizations to the fact that, with the exception of Meretz, every mainstream Zionist party in Israel ran on a ticket of, don't worry, the Arabs won't be in our coalition. Which, you know, if you kind of put that in the context of imagining, you know, either in America or the UK, people saying that about Jews, you know, would be absolutely horrifying. So it's still, you know, even though there's interest, it still doesn't translate into kind of serious criticism of policy, but it, you know, effectively it's the same. I just wanted to add one thing because I think it's relevant. In terms of Liz's question about what happens to you know, Palestinians living in any territory that gets annexed. So some of you might have seen that on Sunday, Mark Reged, who's the Israeli ambassador here, addressed the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which for Jeremy's sake is our kind of representative body in which there are deputies from every synagogue and most mainstream communal organisations that attend. His words, and you can watch the video of him speaking on the Board of Deputies Facebook page, but his words, because he was asked that exact question, were, it's my understanding, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's my understanding that they will be offered citizenship. And that the expectation is that the land that is going to be annexed will contain a minimal number of Palestinians, which will make it possible for the state of Israel to do that. What he didn't discuss was the issue that you raised, which the chances of them accepting it is very slim. And if they don't accept it, how does that, you know, where does that leave them? Because the situation we have in East Jerusalem is that there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who live under threat of having their residency revoked because they are not citizens. And so there is, as you say, there is no sense of how it's going to play out in the kind of medium term for any of those people. You know, but if we look at the Golan and, well, the Golan less so, but East Jerusalem particularly, but if we look at both examples, they're not particularly happy. We're going to go to one more question from John, who's up on the screen, and then we're going to kind of draw everything to a close. So John, do you want to, I think you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you, Jeremy, very interesting. About a week ago, a quarter of British MPs from all parties apart from the Ulster Unionists, I think, signed a letter to the British Prime Minister likening the threat of annexation to the Russian annexation of Crimea and reminding the PM that led to international sanctions, and saying that, that Netanyahu should understand that there would be sanctions against Israel if they pursued a similar policy. Now, if that were to happen, and it's a big if, of course, with the present British government, what effect would that have, such a threat, on attitudes in the United States on the one hand and on Israel, in Israel on the other?
I mean, sadly, what I have always seen is that in Israeli society broadly, when the international quote unquote community, Europeans in particular, threaten, it is sort of a circle the wagons and rally around the flag moment. You know, you see, they all hate us anyway kind of an attitude, and it's turned into not so much a discussion about whether or not the policy decision that was made that brought about the sanction was right or wrong and should be reversed. It's turned into a question of whether or not the people threatening the sanctions are actually at heart anti-Semites and hate us all anyway, and therefore whatever they're proposing is just proof of that and not proof that we did something wrong. And you know, this is just a tribal response, and it's sort of hardwired into the sociology and psychology of society. And so, you know, I don't know what to tell you. I don't think that threats, you know, are going to move Israeli public opinion. You know, in terms of American Jews, there's a much greater reluctance to go there. I think younger American Jews, the liberal young Jews. You see an overwhelming movement now towards a desire to see boycotts and see some form of pressure or consequence is the word that I hear a lot for Israeli actions that might be taken. But that is not yet the generation in charge, and the generations that are in charge and have been in charge are not ready for that kind of an attitude. The word boycott still harkens back to, pre-Nazi Germany and to other places where Jews have faced economic boycotts. And it's just very, very hard to see that having a positive impact on, moving people in the right direction in their thinking. Unfortunately, I mean, I'm sorry to say that, it's one of the tools that people would turn to try to shift what's going on, but I'm not 100% convinced that it actually will have the desired effect.
Thanks, Jeremy. I mean, I think this is a big question, which is the topic of another conversation, a conversation that we will probably have kind of off camera at some point, which is that, the follow-on is, where does that leave all of us? If annexation happens on July the 1st, what is available to us as progressive Zionist organizations outside of Israel in terms of how we respond to that, and you raise that exact challenge that we're all facing. There is one final question. I'm going to read it. So apologies, Stephen, that you don't get to kind of ask it, but we're just running out of time and it's quicker. And the question is, how concerned are you that annexation will accelerate the delegitimization of Israel and Zionism? Well, you've kind of touched on this, both amongst liberal American opinion, but even more in Europe.
Very, very, very concerned. I mean, I think that that's one of the biggest problems, and I think it goes to your prior comment, Hannah, which is, where does this leave liberal Zionists? Those of us who are deeply committed to the state of Israel, who really believe in it, who understand, that there's a lot of people in Israel that don't agree with all of this, that the center of Israeli society is not at its heart annexationist and, seeking the river to the sea for all for themselves. Where does it leave us? I think that this is a real challenge to our politics and to our philosophy. People to our left will say you're sellouts and you don't have the, guts and the backbone to really stand up and make the threats that are necessary. People to our right will say you're all naive and wimps and we won and that was the point. And so we're really at a challenge. But the bottom line that keeps me going is that I know that we're right. That I know that the folks to the far left, the folks to the far right, they are not leading in a direction that actually ends conflict. They're not leading and offering solutions that actually provide real security. The type of Israel that we want to see and that we believe is appropriate to be the national homeland of our people that fulfills the values on which we were raised, that's not the Israel that any of those people on either end of the spectrum actually want to see. Only what we stand for is actually what the country was founded on, the principles on which it was founded on, and that we know are the right ones. So, we have a lot of talking to do after July if this really goes forward about strategy and tactics, but it doesn't change my conviction that what we stand for is the right proposition and will ultimately win out because it is where the majority of people in the Jewish community worldwide actually stand. It's with us and the views that we hold.
Well, on that positive note, we're going to draw things to a close. So, Jeremy, thanks so much. I know that it's really a kind of hectic moment for you in America, and we're really grateful for your time. I wanted to actually it's a good segue how you end it, because certainly the debate that's going on here today in kind of British Jewry is to what extent the refusal of mainstream Jewish community organizations to come out and speak out against this, to what extent does that add to the kind of delegitimization of Israel and Zionism? And are they doing actually a great disservice to the cause by remaining silent? Some of you might have seen, and you have probably received a fair few emails from Yachad about this, that there are a number of letters now circulating that, that have come from a kind of wide base of people in the community, and we've helped to push them out, calling on the Board of Deputies of British Jews to stand up and actually speak out against annexation and to make it clear that this is not something that organisations that support two states can remain silent on. There is a letter that has now been signed by close to about 500 young people, members of Jewish youth movements here, members of Jewish societies and university campuses, asking that exact question, which if you don't speak out, how can the Board of Deputies remain a relevant organisation to us? There's a second one, that also circulating, which is aimed at everybody who doesn't count themselves as being in the young category anymore, also asking something very similar. If you've not put your names to those letters, it would be obviously really important. You know, the more people that are kind of applying that pressure, the better. We will circulate that information to you after this webinar, probably in the morning, and it would be really helpful for you to sign those letters, to push out the get the word out, and to really make sure that this debate is kind of on people's agendas. Because the thing that we haven't mentioned here tonight is obviously the whole backdrop to this conversation is that the world is consumed with a horrendous global pandemic that is killing. I mean, you know, the UK and the US are competing on the global stage for you know, deaths per capita, but you know, the world has got its attention elsewhere, and so we face an additional challenge here that it's too easy for decision makers, for Jewish communal leaders to say, we don't have time to engage with this, which will allow this thing to happen in July, you know, and to go unchecked. So it really requires kind of concerned members of our communities to really, you know, make sure that people understand that even though attention is diverted, this is still a live issue for people. So please help kind of make that happen. And I just want to also flag to you, if you've not seen, that on Tuesday next week, we are doing a webinar with Jeremy, your former ambassador, Palestinian ambassador in Washington. So Hussam Zomlot, who, after he was removed from America by your president, when your Palestinian embassy was closed, he came to London, and he will be joining us for a discussion about how he, as someone who's relatively senior in Palestinian leadership, sees what's going on and how it's likely to be received in the Palestinian territories, and what role he sees, you know, in terms of a partnership between Palestinians and the diaspora Jewish community. So that is 7 o'clock on Tuesday night, and please do sign up, because I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. Jeremy, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time, and I hope that we will have you back again. The world seems much smaller these days, and it's much easier to do it. So we look forward to you coming back in November and telling us that you were right about the election results.
1 for 2 is pretty good. I'd be happy with that.
All right, we will speak to you all soon. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. Bye. Bye.